The sound haunts me still. That distinctive metallic scrape of prosthetic against stone, echoing through the hollow chambers of the haligtree like a death knell. It's a sound I would come to know intimately, carved into my memory by repetition and terror. But on that first morning, climbing the consecrated routes toward Elphael, I mistook it for wind through broken architecture. How foolish I was. My name is Gareth, and before I became another cautionary tale whispered around sites of grace, I was nothing more than a sellsword with calloused hands and modest ambitions. The shattering had been kind to men like me, not the tarnished called by grace, not the great heroes destined to become Elden Lord, but the forgotten masses who cleaned up their messes for coin. I'd spent the better part of 3 years carving through the chaos of the lands between, selling my sword to whoever paid best, staying alive through cunning rather than destiny. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was camped in the ruins outside Ordina liturgical town, counting my runes by the dying embers of my fire. The previous night's contract had gone well, clearing out a pack of clean-rot knights that had been harassing merchant caravans. Nothing I couldn't handle with patience and the right equipment. The rot-infused bastards were tough, but predictable. Dodge the grab, watch for the spear thrust, exploit their slow recovery. Routine work for someone who'd survived this long in post-shattering politics. That's when she approached me. Lady Millicent, though I didn't know her name then, emerged from the pre-dawn mist like a vision from a fever dream. Her red hair caught what little light filtered through the perpetual haze of Caelid, and despite her obvious affliction, the scarlet rot blooming from her right arm in grotesque golden flowers, she moved with an elegance that spoke of noble birth. "Sellsword," she called, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed at odds with the corruption eating away at her flesh. "I have need of your services." I looked up from my rune counting, noting the way she favored her left side, how her breathing came shallow and quick. The rot was advancing faster than whatever treatment she'd been receiving. I'd seen it before. This particular desperation, the way dying people clutched at increasingly impossible hopes. "Depends on the work," I replied, not unkindly, "and the payment." She produced a small leather pouch that clinked with the heavy sound of high-grade runes. More than I'd made in the past month. "I need something retrieved from the haligtree, from Elphael specifically." I nearly laughed. "Lady, with respect, Elphael isn't a place you just walk into and walk out of. The stories alone—" "The stories are true," she interrupted, and something in her tone made me stop. Every word. The clean rot nights, the corruption that turns the air itself into poison, the way the very roots of the haligtree writhe with malevolent life. All of it. She paused, her grey eyes finding mine. "But what the stories don't tell you is that sometimes you have no choice." She told me about the needle then, Miquella's needle, forged to ward off the influence of outer gods, hidden somewhere in the highest reaches of the haligtree, a cure for the scarlet rot that was slowly consuming her from within, her last hope and worth any price. "The needle isn't just sitting on a shelf," I pointed out. "If it's real, if it's there, it's guarded." "Yes," she said simply. "By her." I didn't need to ask who her referred to. Everyone in the lands between knew the stories of Malenia, Blade of Miquella, the goddess of rot, the warrior who had never known defeat, whose very presence could corrupt an entire region, the one who had turned Caelid into the festering wasteland it was today, during her battle with Star Scourge Radan. "You're asking me to die," I said. "I'm asking you to try." She opened the pouch wider, revealing not just runes but a collection of rare materials, smithing stones, golden runes, even what looked like a shard of an ancient dragon's scale. "This is everything I have. My inheritance, my life savings, items I've collected over years of searching for a cure. It's yours if you retrieve the needle." I stared at the fortune in her hands, then at her face. Behind the noble bearing, I could see the fear. Not of death. She'd already made peace with that, but of dying without trying every possible option. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself years ago, when I'd lost everything to the war. The smart play was to walk away, take a smaller contract, something manageable, live to fight another day. But the smart play didn't account for the way she stood there, not begging, not demanding, just hoping. And it didn't account for the simple arithmetic of my situation. I was getting older, slower, and the lands between didn't suffer slow sellswords to live long. "Double," I said finally. "I beg your pardon." "Double the payment. And I want half up front." I gestured toward the corruption spreading up her arm. "No offense, but you might not live to pay the balance." For the first time since approaching me, she smiled. It transformed her entire face, making her look years younger despite the rot eating away at her vitality. "Agreed. But I have one condition of my own." "Which is?" "If you encounter her, Malenia, and you have a choice between the needle and your life." She paused, her expression growing serious. "Choose your life. The needle is worthless if no one survives to use it." I should have heeded that warning. I should have recognized it for what it was. Not just good advice, but a prophecy of exactly what would happen. But I was young enough to believe in my own skill, experienced enough to think I could handle any challenge, and desperate enough to need that payment. "Deal," I said, extending my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong despite the corruption, her skin fever-hot where the rot had taken hold. "Then may the Erdtree's grace light your path, Gareth of the Wandering Blade." I blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Your reputation precedes you. The sellsword who survived the siege of the Round Table Hold, who fought alongside the recusant knights in the Volcano Manor campaigns, who walked away from Rykard's offer of immortality because he preferred his soul uncorrupted." She released my hand. "You're exactly the kind of man who might survive what I'm asking." As she walked away, disappearing back into the mist as suddenly as she'd arrived, I found myself listening to the sounds of the morning. Birds calling from the twisted trees, wind whistling through broken stone, the distant howl of something inhuman echoing across Caelid's poisoned landscape. But underneath it all, carried on a breeze from the north, I could swear I heard something else. A rhythmic scraping, metal on stone, like a blade being dragged across a grindstone, or like prosthetic limbs moving through ancient corridors, patient and eternal, waiting for the next fool to climb the halig tree in search of something they'd never lived to claim. I gathered my gear, secured my payment, and began the long journey north toward Ordina and the portal that would take me to the halig tree. Behind me, Caelid stretched out in all its scarlet-poisoned glory, the result of Malenia's last great battle, a warning written in corrupted earth and twisted flesh. I should have turned back then, should have returned Lady Millicent's payment and found easier work, but the sound was already in my head, that metallic scraping, calling me forward like a siren's song. The needle awaited, and so did she. The journey to Ordina should have taken 2 days. It took me 5, and by the 3rd day I understood why so few people spoke of traveling through northern Caelid. This wasn't just the ordinary corruption I'd grown accustomed to. The twisted trees, the blood-red sky, the occasional pack of giant dogs with human hands where paws should be. This was something deeper, more personal, as if the very air itself was watching me. I first noticed it while crossing the Dragon Barrow, that elevated plateau where the massive corpse of an ancient dragon serves as both landmark and warning. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a scent I couldn't identify. Sweet like blooming flowers, but underneath, the unmistakable stench of decay. It reminded me of a battlefield 3 days after the fighting ended, when the bodies had begun to rot, but someone had tried to mask the smell with perfume. That's when I saw my first clean-rot knight, since leaving Lady Millicent. He was standing perfectly still among a grove of crystallized trees, his golden armor gleaming despite the layers of scarlet corruption that had grown over it like barnacles. At first, I thought he was dead, just another victim of the rot, preserved in his final moment like a grotesque statue, but as I approached trying to give him a wide berth, his head turned to follow my movement with mechanical precision. "Tarnished," he said, his voice muffled by the helmet but carrying an odd resonance as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "You walk the path to the halig tree." It wasn't a question. I kept my hand near my sword, but didn't draw it, just passing through, as was I, once. The knight raised his hand, and I could see the way the scarlet rot had fused his gauntlet to the spear he carried, metal and flesh and corruption flowing together like molten gold. I served her faithfully. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, the most skilled warrior ever born. I was one of her chosen, her personal guard, sworn to defend her and her brother's dream of a perfect world. Despite myself, I found myself listening. The stories of the Cleanrot Knights were legend, elite warriors who had willingly exposed themselves to the Scarlet Rot to better serve their goddess. They were said to be completely loyal, utterly devoted, and entirely mad. "What happened?" I asked. The knight's laugh was like grinding metal. "I learned the truth about devotion, about what it means to serve a god who cannot control her own power." He gestured around us with his corrupted spear. "Look at Caelid. This was once green land, fertile and beautiful. The battle between Lady Malenia and General Raiden lasted only hours, but her blooming poisoned everything for miles around. And do you know what she said when she saw what she had done?" I waited. Nothing. She felt no regret, no sorrow for the innocent lives corrupted by her power, because gods do not apologize for being themselves. The knight took a step toward me, and I could hear the wet, squelching sound his feet made inside his boots. "Tell me, Sellsword, do you know what the Scarlet Rot truly is?" "A disease, a curse. Some say it's connected to an outer god." "All true, but incomplete." He raised his free hand, and I watched in fascination and horror as scarlet flowers bloomed directly from his palm, pushing through the gaps in his armor like living things. The rot is evolution. It is change forced upon the unwilling. It takes what you are and makes you into something new, something better adapted to serve its purposes. The pain is temporary. The transformation is eternal. I'd heard enough religious fanaticism in my time to recognize it, but something about his words carried a weight of lived experience that chilled me more than any threat could have. "And you think that's a good thing?" "I think it's inevitable." He turned away from me, resuming his vigil among the crystallized trees. "The Halig tree calls to all who suffer from the rot. They climb its roots, seeking salvation, seeking Miquella's cure. But salvation and cure are not the same thing, Sellsword. Remember that, when you stand before her. Remember that some transformations cannot be undone." I left him there, that corrupted guardian speaking riddles to the poisoned wind, but his words followed me for the rest of the journey. By the time I reached the outskirts of Ordina, I was jumping at shadows, seeing scarlet flowers in every splash of color, hearing that metallic scraping in every sound the wind made through the ruins. Ordina, liturgical town, was a masterpiece of architectural impossibility. The entire settlement seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Buildings that appeared solid from one angle became transparent from another. Staircases that led up also somehow led down, and throughout it all the ghostly forms of black knife assassins flickered in and out of reality like deadly mirages. But it wasn't the assassins that unsettled me most. It was the silence. In every other settlement I'd visited in the lands between, there was always some sound of life. Merchants calling their wares, guards patrolling their posts, the everyday bustle of people trying to survive in an impossible world. Ordina had none of that. The few inhabitants I could see moved with the same mechanical precision as the Cleanrot Knight, going through the motions of their daily routines without any apparent awareness of their surroundings. I found the portal to the Halig tree, exactly where Lady Millicent had told me it would be, at the top of the town's central tower, behind a barrier that required lighting 4 flame braziers scattered throughout the settlement. Simple enough in theory. In practice, it meant navigating a maze of invisible assassins while avoiding the attention of the town's other guardians. It took me the better part of a day to light all 4 braziers, and by the time I finally stood before the portal, my nerves were stretched thin as wire. The gateway itself was beautiful in a way that made my teeth ache, a swirling vortex of golden light that seemed to sing with harmonies just beyond the range of human hearing. But as I prepared to step through, I heard footsteps behind me. "You're making a mistake," a voice said. I spun around to find another figure approaching, not one of the town's ghostly residents, but a living person, a Tarnished like me, judging by the faint golden light that clung to his form. He was tall, lean, with the kind of scars that spoke of serious combat experience. But what caught my attention were his eyes. They held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and lived to regret it. "The Halig tree," he continued, stopping just outside the portal's influence. "You're going to the Halig tree. I can see it in your stance, the way you're trying to steel yourself for what's ahead. He shook his head slowly. I came back to warn others, to tell them what I learned up there. And what did you learn? That some battles aren't meant to be won, that some challenges exist not to test your skill but to teach you humility. He pulled back his cloak, revealing armor that had been cut to ribbons and hastily repaired. I fought her 12 times. 12 times I climbed those routes, walked those corrupted halls, stood before her throne and drew my blade. And 12 times she killed me. But you're still alive. Am I? He laughed bitterly. Each death changed me. Each resurrection took something away. By the end, I wasn't fighting to win anymore. I was fighting because I'd forgotten how to do anything else. He gestured toward the portal. That light calls to warriors, promises glory and legendary battles. But Malenia, she doesn't fight for glory. She fights because that's what she is. A weapon given form, a blade that exists only to cut. I thought of Lady Millicent, of her fever-bright eyes and the desperation hidden behind her noble bearing. Someone's counting on me. Someone was counting on me too. My village, my family, everyone I'd sworn to protect. His expression darkened. They're all dead now. Turned to scarlet flowers while I was playing hero in the haligtree. The rot doesn't wait for your personal quest to conclude. Despite his words, I found myself stepping toward the portal. The golden light was warm against my skin, and I could swear I heard something calling from the other side. Not voices, exactly, but a kind of musical invitation that made my heart race with anticipation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because someone told me the same thing once, and I didn't listen either." He stepped aside, clearing my path to the portal. "If you're determined to go, at least remember this. She's not evil. Malenia isn't some cackling villain who delights in suffering. She's a tragedy given form, a god who never wanted to be divine. That makes her more dangerous than any monster you've ever faced." "How so?" "Because when you fight a monster, you can hate it. You can use that hate to fuel your strength, to push through pain and fear and exhaustion. But Malenia..." He paused, searching for the right words. "When you fight Malenia, part of you will understand why she became what she is. Part of you will even admire her dedication, her refusal to surrender despite the corruption eating away at her body and soul. And that understanding, that moment of sympathy, will get you killed faster than any blade." The portal pulsed behind me, its song growing more insistent. I could feel it tugging at something deep in my chest, calling me forward with promises I couldn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to believe. "Last chance," the scarred Tarnished said. "Walk away. Find another quest, another client, another way to make your fortune. The lands between are full of opportunities for a skilled sellsword." I looked back at him one final time, noting the way his hands shook slightly, the haunted expression that never quite left his eyes. Then I stepped through the portal, feeling the world dissolve around me in a cascade of golden light and impossible harmonies. The last thing I heard before the transition completed was his voice, carried on a wind that couldn't possibly exist between dimensions. "Tell her I said goodbye." Then I was somewhere else entirely, standing on a platform of woven roots high above a realm that defied every natural law I'd ever learned. The haligtree stretched out below me, a massive organic structure that seemed to be part tree, part city, part living cathedral. And from somewhere far above, carried on air thick with the scent of blooming flowers and ancient decay, came that sound again. Scrape, 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 metal against stone, patient and eternal, waiting for me to climb high enough to meet it. The needle was up there somewhere, hidden in those impossible heights. So was she. I began to climb. The first thing that struck me about the haligtree wasn't its impossible size or the way it seemed to bend reality around itself like a lens focusing sunlight. It was the smell. Beneath the expected scents of ancient wood and growing things, there was something else, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. It took me nearly an hour of climbing before I recognized it. The smell of a garden left too long untended, where beautiful flowers had grown wild and begun to rot from their own abundance. The haligtree's trunk was a maze of naturally formed passages, walkways that curved and twisted through the living wood like arteries through a massive body. Bioluminescent fungi provided patches of sickly green light, and everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of the scarlet rot's influence. Golden red blooms erupted from the walls in impossible profusion, their petals seeming to pulse with their own heartbeat. Some were small, delicate things that might have been beautiful in another context. Others were massive growths that blocked entire passageways, forcing me to find alternate routes through increasingly narrow gaps between root and branch. But it was the inhabitants that truly began to unnerve me. I encountered my first group of cleanrot knights about 2 hours into my ascent. Unlike the solitary guardian I'd met in Caelid, these moved in formation, a patrol making its eternal rounds through corridors that had been designed by no human architect. Their armor gleamed with that same golden corruption, but up close I could see the true horror of their transformation. The rot hadn't just infected them, it had integrated with them, becoming part of their very being. One knight's helmet had cracked open like an egg, revealing a mass of scarlet flowers where his face should have been. Another dragged a spear that had fused completely with his arm, metal and bone and corruption flowing together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They didn't attack me immediately. Instead, they surrounded me with military precision, their movements perfectly coordinated despite the obvious pain their transformations must have caused. The one who seemed to be their leader, distinguished by the elaborate golden antlers that had grown from his shoulders, spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Another seeker comes to the Halig tree," he said. "Another pilgrim drawn by dreams of cure and salvation." "I'm just passing through," I replied, keeping my hands visible but ready to reach for my weapons. The corridor was narrow enough that they couldn't all attack at once, but wide enough that I couldn't easily escape. They all say that at first. The leader tilted his antlered head, and I caught a glimpse of golden light where his eyes should have been. But the Halig tree calls only to those who carry the rot within them, whether they know it or not. Tell me, stranger, have you felt it yet? The itch beneath your skin, the sweetness in the air that makes you want to breathe deeper despite the danger. I had felt it, actually. Ever since entering the tree, I'd been fighting the urge to remove my gloves and run my bare hands along the corrupted walls, to taste the nectar that dripped from the blooming flowers, to surrender to the languid warmth that seemed to emanate from the very air. But admitting that seemed like a dangerous mistake. "I'm here for Miquella's needle," I said instead. "Nothing more." The laughter that erupted from the patrol was like the sound of breaking glass. "Miquella's needle!" the leader exclaimed. "Oh, stranger, you are either very brave or very foolish. The needle rests in the highest reaches of Elphael, in the gardens where our goddess dreams her poisoned dreams. To reach it, you must pass through the rot-touched city, climb the branches that bleed golden sap, and stand before the throne of the blade of Miquella herself. I know the risks." "Do you?" Another knight stepped forward, and I could see that the rot had completely consumed his lower jaw, leaving only a writhing mass of golden tendrils where his mouth should have been. When he spoke, his voice came from somewhere inside his chest. "Do you know that she sleeps fitfully, our goddess? That her dreams are filled with battles that never end, with a brother who never returns, with a rot that spreads no matter how hard she tries to contain it? Do you know that in her sleep, she sometimes mistakes visitors for enemies and enemies for the brother she has lost?" The leader raised a corrupted hand. "Enough. The pilgrim will learn, as we all learned. The Halig tree teaches its lessons well, and Malenia is the final examination." He gestured toward a passage that curved upward through the living wood. "Follow that path. It will take you to the outer reaches of Elphael. But remember, stranger, every step you climb brings you closer, not just to your goal, but to your transformation. The rot is patient, it can wait." They stepped aside, allowing me to pass, but I could feel their golden eyes following me long after I'd left them behind. The passage they'd indicated was steeper than the ones I'd traveled before, and as I climbed, I began to notice changes in the tree itself. The walls were smoother here, almost polished, and the bioluminescent fungi gave way to patches of actual sunlight filtering down from somewhere far above. But the light itself seemed wrong, too golden, too warm, carrying with it that same sweet corruption that permeated everything in this place. It was in one of these pools of golden light that I found the first body. She had been a warrior once, judging by the quality of her armor and the massive great sword that lay beside her. But the scarlet rot had claimed her completely, transforming her corpse into a garden of impossible beauty. Flowers bloomed from every opening in her armor, their petals the color of dried blood and fresh gold. Her face was barely recognizable beneath a mask of crystallized sap, but her expression was peaceful, almost ecstatic. As I knelt beside her, trying to determine how long she'd been dead, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her armor was marked with the same symbol I'd seen on Lady Millicent's belongings, the sign of those who sought Miquella's needle. This warrior had been here before me, following the same path, driven by the same desperate hope. I found 11 more bodies on my way to Elphael proper. Each one told the same story: skilled warriors and desperate pilgrims, all seeking the cure that waited in the highest branches of the Haligtree, all transformed by the very corruption they'd hoped to escape. Some had made it farther than others. The last body I found wore armor I recognized from the legendary smiths of the Round Table Hold, suggesting someone with considerable resources and connections. But in the end, the rot had claimed them all. The entrance to Elphael, Brace of the Haligtree, was marked by a massive archway grown from living wood and carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Beyond the archway, the tree opened into a vast hollow space, a city built into and from the Haligtree itself, with buildings that grew like fruit from the inner walls and bridges woven from root and branch that spanned impossible distances. But calling it a city was misleading. Cities were built by and for the living. Elphael was a mausoleum disguised as a metropolis, a monument to the beautiful dead. Every surface bloomed with scarlet flowers, every building dripped with golden sap, every bridge and walkway pulsed with organic rhythms that matched no heartbeat I'd ever heard. And everywhere the inhabitants went about their business with the mechanical precision of the truly lost. I saw clean rot knights tending gardens that grew nothing but corruption, their movements careful and deliberate as they watered poisonous blooms with liquid gold. I saw scholars bent over books whose pages had been replaced by leaves that whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech. I saw children, or things that had once been children, playing games that involved arranging human bones in patterns that made my vision blur if I stared too long. None of them paid me any attention as I made my way through their impossible city. I was just another seeker, another pilgrim drawn by promises of salvation that would only lead to transformation. They'd seen countless others like me, and they would see countless more. My presence was no more remarkable than rainfall in a storm. But as I climbed higher through Elphael's many levels, following the path that led ever upward toward the crown of the Haligtree, I began to hear something that hadn't been there before. Music, faint and distant, but growing stronger with each step I took. It wasn't the harsh, grinding sound I'd heard from outside, but something more subtle, more beautiful. A melody that seemed to speak of longing and loss, of love that had curdled into obsession, of power that had become a prison. The music was coming from above, from the very heart of the tree where the throne room waited, where she waited. I passed through districts devoted to crafts I couldn't name, workshops where corrupted artisans created works of art from flesh and bone and living metal. I walked across bridges that spanned chasms filled with golden fog, past windows that looked out onto gardens where every tree bore fruit in the shape of sleeping faces. And always the music grew stronger, more complex, more beautiful and terrible with each note. It was in the final district before the throne room that I encountered him, the pilgrim who had spoken to me at the portal in Ordina. But he was changed now, transformed by whatever he'd experienced in his repeated attempts to challenge the goddess above. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by something worse, a kind of terrible understanding, a knowledge that no human mind was meant to carry. "You came," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. "Despite my warnings, despite everything I told you about the futility of this quest, you still climbed the tree. The needle is real," he interrupted. "I've seen it, held it, felt its power humming against my skin like a caged bird desperate for flight." He smiled, and I could see that his teeth had been replaced by tiny golden flowers. "But to reach it, you must pass her test. And her test changes you whether you pass or fail." I looked around at the district we stood in, buildings that pulsed with organic life, streets paved with crystallized sap, air thick with spores that made my head swim with visions of impossible beauty. What happened to you? I learned the truth about devotion, about what it means to fight a god who has forgotten how to lose. He gestured upward, toward the music that filled the air like golden syrup. She's waiting for you now, can you hear her song? She only sings when she dreams, and she only dreams when she's about to wake. Someone new is coming to challenge her, and part of her, the part that still remembers being human, is actually excited by the prospect. The music swelled, and for a moment I could swear I heard words in it, a lullaby sung in a language that spoke directly to my bones, promising rest and peace and an end to all struggle. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, and it terrified me more than any roar or battle cry ever could. "Turn back," the transformed pilgrim said, but his voice was distant now, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Turn back while you still remember why you came." But I couldn't turn back. Not with Lady Millicent's fever-bright eyes burning in my memory, not with her payment weighing heavy in my pack, not with the music calling to something deep in my soul that I'd never known existed. I left the pilgrim standing in his district of beautiful horrors and began the final ascent to the throne room of Malenia, Blade of Miquella. Behind me, the music followed, growing stronger with each step. Ahead of me, that rhythmic scraping sound had returned, metal against stone, patient and eternal, waiting for the next fool to climb high enough to meet it. The needle awaited, but first I would have to face the goddess who guarded it. The Blade of Miquella, the goddess of rot, the warrior who had never known defeat, the most dangerous being in all the lands between. The throne room of Malenia, Blade of Miquella, was not what I had expected. I had prepared myself for grandeur, for soaring architecture and golden splendor befitting a demigod. Instead, I found myself standing at the edge of a vast circular chamber carved from the living heart of the halig tree itself. The walls curved upward like the inside of a flower, their surface covered in a tapestry of roots and branches that pulsed with organic rhythms. Pools of stagnant water dotted the floor, their surfaces covered with a film of golden pollen that swirled in patterns too complex to be random. And everywhere, on every surface, growing from every crack and crevice, the scarlet flowers bloomed in impossible profusion. But it was the silence that truly unsettled me. After climbing through districts filled with the sounds of corrupted life, after listening to that haunting music grow stronger with each step, the throne room was tomb quiet. The only sound was my own breathing, unnaturally loud in the still air, and the soft splash of my footsteps as I waded through the ankle-deep water toward the center of the chamber. That's where I saw her. Malenia sat upon a throne grown from the tree itself, her form motionless as carved marble. She was smaller than I had expected, not the towering giant of legend, but a woman of perhaps average height, made imposing not by size but by presence. Her armor was a masterwork of golden artistry, each piece shaped and fitted with such precision that it seemed more like a second skin than protective gear. But it was damaged, scored with countless battle wounds, stained with rust that might have been old blood, marked with the distinctive golden corrosion of the scarlet rot. Her face was hidden behind a golden helm that covered everything except her mouth and chin, but what I could see was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Perfect lips slightly parted in sleep, skin pale as moonlight where it wasn't touched by corruption, the suggestion of features that belonged in courtly songs rather than on a battlefield. But her right arm was gone. In its place, a prosthetic limb crafted from the same golden metal as her armor extended from her shoulder. It was a work of art in its own right, joints articulated with impossible precision, surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, fingers that ended in claws sharp enough to cut stone. As I watched, the prosthetic twitched slightly, and I heard that sound again, the metallic scraping that had haunted my dreams since first entering the halig tree. Her legs were gone too, I realized with growing horror. Both had been replaced with prosthetics that merged seamlessly with her armor, their surfaces covered in the same scarlet blooms that infected everything else in this cursed tree. She wasn't sitting on her throne by choice. She was anchored to it, connected to the halig tree itself, through cables of living metal and organic corruption that pulsed with shared heartbeats. This wasn't a goddess on her throne. This was a prisoner, in a beautiful cage, held captive by her own power. I stood there for what felt like hours, studying her sleeping form and trying to understand what I was seeing. The stories spoke of Malenia as a warrior without equal, a being of such terrible power that she could corrupt entire regions with her presence. But the figure before me looked more like a victim than a conqueror, a woman trapped by forces she couldn't control, dreaming fitful dreams in a prison of her own making. That's when I noticed the flowers. They weren't just growing from the walls and floor, they were growing from her. Scarlet blooms erupted from the joints of her armor, from the gaps where prosthetic met flesh, from places on her body that I tried not to look at too closely. Each flower pulsed with its own rhythm, and as I watched I began to understand that they weren't parasites feeding on her. They were part of her, organs of some impossible biology that transcended the boundary between plant and animal, corruption and divine power. The scarlet rot wasn't afflicting Malenia. Malenia was the scarlet rot, given form and consciousness, and trapped in a body that could barely contain the forces coursing through it. "You're staring," she said without moving, her voice carrying a musical quality that made the flowers around us tremble in harmony. How rude. I jumped back, my hand going instinctively to my sword hilt, but she made no move to attack. She didn't even open her eyes. "I can feel you there, stranger. Your heartbeat, your breathing, the way your boots disturb the sacred pools." A smile played across her lips, not cruel but genuinely amused. "It's been some time since anyone climbed this high. The last visitor was persistent. He returned again and again, each death teaching him new lessons in futility. But you feel different. Calmer, more accepting of what's about to happen." "I'm here for the needle," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Miquella's needle." She sighed, and the sound was like wind through dying leaves. "My beloved brother's greatest creation, forged to ward off the influence of outer gods. You seek to cure someone of the scarlet rot, I assume?" "Yes." "And you believe the needle will accomplish this miracle?" I hesitated. "I hope so." Now she did move, turning her head toward me with mechanical precision. Her eyes opened, revealing pupils like pools of liquid gold, surrounded by irises that shifted between red and amber and colors I had no names for. They were the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen, and they were completely, utterly mad. "Hope," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Such a precious thing. I remember hope. I hoped that my brother's dream of a perfect world could be achieved through strength of arms. I hoped that my curse could be contained, controlled, turned into a weapon that would serve righteousness. I hoped that love and devotion would be enough to overcome any obstacle." She rose from her throne with fluid grace, the cables connecting her to the tree stretching and reconfigurating to accommodate her movement. Standing, she was taller than I had thought, not through physical height, but through sheer presence. Power radiated from her like heat from a forge, making the air itself heavy and difficult to breathe. "Tell me, Seeker, what do you know of the scarlet rot?" "It's a corruption, a disease that transforms living things into something else. Incomplete, but not wrong." She began to walk toward me, her prosthetic legs moving with perfect mechanical precision, while her remaining organic leg seemed to flow rather than step. The scarlet rot is evolution accelerated beyond mortal comprehension. It takes what exists and transforms it into what could be, given enough time and enough will to change. But evolution without guidance is chaos, and chaos— She gestured around us at the impossible garden city. "Chaos creates beauty and horror in equal measure." As she approached, I could see more details that my mind had initially rejected. The flowers growing from her armor weren't just decorative. They were functional organs, pumping golden fluid through transparent stems, filtering the very air she breathed, serving purposes I couldn't begin to imagine. Her prosthetic arm moved with more than mechanical precision. It flowed like liquid metal, reshaping itself moment by moment to better serve whatever task she had in mind. "I was like you once," she continued, stopping just outside sword reach, human or close enough. "I had hopes and dreams and people I loved. My brother Miquella was the most precious thing in all the world to me, brilliant and kind, and cursed with eternal youth that trapped his mind in a child's body. When he began his great work, his attempt to create a new order free from the influence of the outer gods, I swore to protect him. She raised her prosthetic hand, and I watched in fascination as the fingers extended into blade-length claws, then retracted back to normal proportions. But protection requires power, and power always comes with a price. The scarlet rot was my inheritance, a curse from an outer god that I couldn't escape, only contain, or so I thought. What changed? I met Radahn. Her expression darkened, and for the first time I saw something like genuine emotion flicker across her features. The mighty General Radahn, holding back the very stars with his gravitational mastery, commanding an army that had never known defeat. We fought for 3 days and 3 nights, neither able to gain decisive advantage. So I did what I swore I would never do. The flowers around us began to pulse faster, their golden light growing brighter. The water at our feet started to bubble and steam. I bloomed. The word hung in the air like a curse, and suddenly I understood. The devastation of Caelid, the corruption that had transformed an entire region into a festering wasteland. It hadn't been an accident or a side effect of their battle. It had been Malenia's choice, a deliberate release of power that had sacrificed countless innocent lives to achieve victory. I let the rot consume me completely, transformed myself into a living weapon of such terrible power that even Radahn couldn't stand against it. The battle ended in mutual destruction, he driven mad by corruption, me rendered comatose by the effort of containing what I had become. But I had won. I had protected my brother's dream through the ultimate sacrifice of my humanity. She was close enough now that I could smell her, not the sickly sweetness of corruption, but something more complex, flowers and metal, and something indefinable that might have been starlight given scent. But when I woke, weeks later, I discovered the truth. My brother was gone, taken while I lay unconscious, spirited away by forces I couldn't identify or track. All my sacrifice, all my transformation, and I had failed in the one thing that truly mattered. I wanted to step back, but found I couldn't move. Her golden eyes held me like a physical force, and I realized that this wasn't just conversation, it was confession, the unburdening of guilt that had been building for years or decades or centuries. So I returned here to the Haligtree to wait and hope and dream of his return. The rot continued its work, transforming me further with each passing day, until I was no longer certain where Malenia ended and the corruption began. But still, I hoped. Still, I dreamed that he would come back, that we would finish his great work together. The smile that crossed her lips was heartbreaking in its sadness. But hope is a poison more deadly than any rot, and dreams are just lies we tell ourselves to make the waiting bearable. She turned away from me, walking back toward her throne with that same fluid grace. The needle you seek rests in my private chambers, beyond this throne room. It is real, it is powerful, and it can indeed cure the scarlet rot, in those who haven't progressed too far along the path of transformation. But to reach it, she settled back onto her throne, the cables reconnecting with soft clicking sounds that made me think of bones breaking. To reach it, you must prove that you understand the true nature of strength, not the strength to destroy, which any brute can master, but the strength to endure loss, to accept transformation, to continue fighting even when victory becomes meaningless. Her prosthetic hand scraped against the armrest of her throne. That sound I'd been hearing since first entering the Haligtree, the rhythm that had called me up through level after level of corrupted paradise. Draw your blade, Seeker. Show me the strength of your hope. Show me whether your dream of salvation burns bright enough to illuminate the darkness of divine despair. I drew my sword with hands that trembled only slightly, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. The blade felt pathetically small in my grip, a mortal weapon carried by a mortal man, about to face something that had transcended mortality so completely that the very concepts of life and death had become meaningless. Malenia rose from her throne one final time, her prosthetic limbs extending and reshaping themselves into instruments of war more terrible than anything I had ever seen. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in my bones. I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat. The flowers around us exploded into bloom, filling the air with spores that made reality itself seem to shift and waver. The pools of water at our feet turned to gold, then to blood, then to something that had no name in any human language. And in that moment, as the most dangerous being in all the lands between prepared to teach me the final lesson about hope and despair, I finally understood what the scarred pilgrim had tried to tell me. Some battles aren't meant to be won. Some challenges exist only to show us the limits of mortal ambition, and some truths can only be learned in the moment before they destroy us completely. The first time Malenia killed me, I didn't even see her move. One moment I was standing in ankle-deep water, my sword raised in what I'd foolishly thought was a defensive stance. The next, I was looking down at my own body from somewhere above, watching golden blood pool around what remained of my torso. Her blade, a curved masterwork that seemed to be forged from crystallized sunlight, had cut through my armor, my ribs, and my spine so cleanly that I'd had time to register confusion before the pain hit. Then everything went dark. I woke at the sight of Grace just outside Elphael, my body whole but my mind reeling with the memory of impossible speed. The prosthetic arm that had seemed so cumbersome when she'd been sitting had moved like liquid lightning, reshaping itself into a weapon too fast for human eyes to track. And her face, in the moment before she'd struck, I'd seen something almost like pity in those golden eyes. The second death was slower. I'd learned to watch for the telltale shimmer that preceded her strikes, managed to dodge her first 3 attacks, even landed a blow that rang against her armor like a bell. For a moment I'd felt the intoxicating rush of hope. Perhaps I could do this. Perhaps I was skilled enough to match a demigod in single combat. Then she'd grabbed me with her prosthetic hand, her claws sinking into my shoulder with a wet tearing sound, and I'd felt something far worse than physical pain. The scarlet rot poured into me through the wounds, not just infecting my flesh, but rewriting it at the cellular level. I watched my arm transform into a garden of golden flowers, felt my ribs crack as blooms erupted between them, experienced the sensation of my own bones being replaced by crystalline stems that sang with harmonies only I could hear. The third death was almost gentle by comparison, just a quick thrust through the heart while I stood paralyzed, watching my body betray me in the most beautiful way possible. By the 7th death, I'd begun to understand the rhythm of our dance. Malenia fought with a terrible kind of poetry, her movements flowing from attack to dodge to counterstrike with mechanical precision. But it wasn't mindless repetition. She was learning too, adapting to each change in my strategy, countering techniques I hadn't even fully developed yet. When I tried to exploit her missing limbs, she turned her prosthetics into advantages. When I attempted to use her size against her, she demonstrated that reach meant nothing when your opponent could move faster than thought. But more than that, I began to understand what she'd meant about strength. Each death taught me something new, not just about combat but about endurance, about continuing to fight when victory seemed impossible, about finding purpose in struggle itself rather than in its resolution. The 13th death was different. I'd managed to survive longer than ever before, matching her blow for blow through what felt like hours of combat. My muscles screamed with exhaustion, my armor hung in tatters, and my sword had been nicked and dulled by repeated impacts against her impossible blade. But I was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. That's when she spoke, her voice carrying over the ringing of steel on steel. "Better, you're beginning to understand." "Understand what?" I gasped, dodging a strike that would have taken my head off. "That this isn't about winning." She flowed around my counterattack like water, her prosthetic arm reshaping itself into a shield that absorbed the impact of my blade. Victory and defeat are concepts for those who still believe in endings. We are beyond such limitations. She caught me with a backhand that sent me flying across the chamber, my body skipping across the surface of the corrupted pools like a stone. As I struggled to stand, coughing up blood that had turned gold at the edges, she continued her explanation. "Every challenger who reaches this chamber believes they can succeed where others have failed. They bring their mortal strategies, their human limitations, their naive faith in the possibility of triumph." She began walking toward me, her blade dragging through the water with that distinctive scraping sound. "But I am not a puzzle to be solved, or an obstacle to be overcome. I am a force of nature given consciousness, a living embodiment of transformation that cannot be defeated because I cannot be destroyed. I raised my sword with arms that shook from more than exhaustion. Then why do you keep fighting? If victory is meaningless, why not just let me pass? For the first time since our battle began, she paused. Her golden eyes studied my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl, as if she could see through to my very soul. Because, she said softly, someone must guard the needle. Someone must ensure that those who seek its power understand the price of transformation. And someone, her voice grew even quieter, someone must keep hoping that the next challenger will be different, that they will prove strong enough not to defeat me but to save me. The words hit me harder than any physical blow could have. I saw her then, really saw her, not as a boss to be conquered or an obstacle to be overcome, but as a tragedy given form, a woman who had sacrificed everything for love, only to discover that love without wisdom was just another form of destruction. The scarlet rot isn't your curse, I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. It's your punishment, for what you did to Kaled, for all the innocent lives lost when you chose to bloom. She nodded slowly. The outer god that blessed me with this power knew exactly what it was doing. It gave me strength enough to protect what I loved, but at the cost of losing the ability to control that strength. Every bloom makes me stronger and more monstrous. Every use of my power takes me further from the woman I once was. She was close enough now that I could see the tears tracking down her face, not tears of water, but of liquid gold that left glowing traces on her pale skin. And still, I hope. Still, I dream that someone will come who can break this cycle, who can find a way to grant me the one thing I've never had: defeat. True, final defeat that would release me from this eternal struggle. I looked at my sword, nicked and bloodied, inadequate to the task of harming a demigod. Then I looked at her, beautiful and terrible and utterly lost, trapped by power she'd never wanted in service to a love that had become obsession. I can't defeat you, I said. I know. I'm not strong enough, not skilled enough, not anything enough. I know. I lowered my blade. But I can witness you. I can carry your story to those who come after. I can make sure that people remember Malenia not as the goddess of rot, but as the sister who loved too much and paid too high a price for it. Something changed in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The flowers around us pulsed once, twice, then fell silent. The golden light in her eyes flickered like a candle in wind. You would do that? Carry my burden rather than trying to lift it? Someone should, I said. Someone should remember what you were before the corruption took hold. Someone should mourn the woman who died so the goddess could be born. She stared at me for a long moment, then did something I hadn't expected. She knelt, not in defeat. Malenia, blade of Miquella, could never be defeated. But in recognition of something she'd been seeking for longer than I could imagine. Someone who understood that the greatest strength wasn't the power to destroy, but the wisdom to know when destruction served no purpose. The needle is yours, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not because you've proven worthy of it through combat, but because you've proven worthy of it through compassion. Take it. Use it. Save whoever you came here to save. She gestured toward a passage I hadn't noticed before, an archway that pulsed with soft blue light, free of the corruption that infected everything else in the Haligtree. But know this, Gareth of the Wandering Blade, the needle can cure the rot, but it cannot undo the changes that come from carrying its burden. The woman you seek to save will be healed, but she will also be forever changed by the experience of facing mortality, just as you have been changed by witnessing mine. I sheathed my sword and walked toward the passage, but stopped at the threshold. What happens now? Do you just wait for the next challenger? She rose gracefully to her feet, her prosthetic limbs reconfiguring themselves back into their resting positions. I continue my vigil. I guard the needle and dream of my brother's return, and hope that someday someone will come who can grant me the gift you were wise enough not to attempt. And if no one ever comes? Her smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. Then I will have eternity to perfect my understanding of what it means to love something more than life itself. Perhaps in time, I will even learn whether such love is blessing or curse. I stepped through the passage, feeling the weight of her gaze until the blue light swallowed me completely. When I emerged on the other side, I found myself in a small chamber carved from crystal rather than wood. At its center sat a simple pedestal, and on that pedestal rested Miquella's needle, a delicate thing of silver and gold that hummed with power I could feel in my bones. But as I reached for it, I heard her voice one final time, carried on a wind that couldn't possibly exist in this sealed chamber. Remember me not as I am, but as I was. Remember that love, even corrupted love, even poisonous love, is still the most powerful force in all the lands between. I took the needle, feeling its weight, not just physical but spiritual. The weight of hope fulfilled and tragedy witnessed, the weight of stories that demanded to be told. Behind me, through the passage I'd just traversed, I could hear that distinctive scraping sound resuming, metal against stone, patient and eternal, waiting for the next challenger to climb the haligtree in search of something they'd never truly understand. Malenia, blade of Miquella, had returned to her vigil. The goddess who had never known defeat continued her eternal watch, guarding treasures that could heal the world while remaining forever beyond healing herself. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory is recognizing when victory itself becomes meaningless. The needle pulsed in my hand, ready to fulfill its purpose. But I knew that no matter how many people it saved, no matter how much suffering it prevented, it would never be enough to balance the scales of what I'd witnessed in that impossible throne room. Some burdens, once taken up, can never be set down. Some stories, once heard, change the listener forever. I had come seeking a cure. Instead, I had found something far more dangerous: understanding. The journey down from the haligtree should have been easier than the ascent. I knew the paths now, understood the rhythms of Elphael's corrupted inhabitants, could navigate the maze of root and branch without the desperate urgency that had driven me upward. But every step felt heavier than the last, weighted down not by physical exhaustion, but by the knowledge I now carried. Miquella's needle rested in a specially crafted case at my side, its power contained but not dormant. I could feel it humming against my ribs with each heartbeat, a reminder of what I'd witnessed in that impossible throne room. But more than the needle itself, I carried the memory of golden eyes filled with tears that would never stop flowing, of a voice that spoke of love and loss with equal measures of beauty and despair. The residents of Elphael watched me pass with the same mechanical indifference they'd shown during my ascent, but something had changed in their regard. Where before I'd been just another seeker, another pilgrim drawn by impossible dreams, now I was something else. A witness, perhaps, or a messenger. The clean-wrought knights I encountered stepped aside without challenge, their corrupted faces turning to track my movement with what might have been recognition. It wasn't until I reached the lower levels of the tree that I understood why. I was changed, not physically. The needle's power had protected me from the worst effects of the scarlet rot, preventing the kind of transformation I'd seen claim so many others. But something deeper had shifted, some fundamental alteration in the way I perceived the world around me. Colors seemed more vivid but also more fragile, as if I could see the impermanence lurking beneath every beautiful thing. Sounds carried harmonics I'd never noticed before, layers of meaning that spoke of connections between all living things. Most unsettling of all, I could hear the music now, that haunting melody that had drawn me ever upward through the haligtree. But where before it had been distant and mysterious, now I understood its source. It wasn't coming from Malenia at all. It was coming from the tree itself, from the very roots and branches that formed this impossible structure. The haligtree was singing, had always been singing, a lament for its creator who would never return to see his dream fulfilled. The portal back to Ordina accepted me without resistance, its golden light feeling almost welcoming after the alien energies of Elphael. But even the transition between realms couldn't shake the weight of what I'd experienced. As the world dissolved and reformed around me, I found myself thinking not of Lady Millicent or the payment waiting for me, but of Malenia's final words. Remember me not as I am, but as I was. How could I possibly do that? How could I separate the woman from the goddess, the sister from the weapon, the love from the corruption that had twisted it into something unrecognizable. Every story I might tell would be incomplete. Every memory I shared would carry the stain of what she'd become. Ordina liturgical town felt different upon my return. The ghostly assassins still flickered through their eternal hunt. The architecture still defied natural law, but somehow it all seemed less significant. After witnessing the casual reality-bending power of a true demigod, the town's impossibilities felt almost quaint. I made my way back through Caelid with newfound understanding of the devastation around me. Every twisted tree, every pool of scarlet corruption, every creature driven mad by the rot, they were all echoes of that single moment when Malenia had chosen to bloom, sacrificing her humanity for victory in a battle that ultimately meant nothing. The entire region was a monument to the price of power used without wisdom, love expressed through destruction. But as I traveled, I began to notice something else. Life persisting in the midst of corruption. Plants that had adapted to grow in poisoned soil. Animals that had found ways to coexist with the rot rather than be consumed by it. Even people who had learned to live with low-level infection rather than flee or succumb. Caelid wasn't just dying. It was evolving, finding new forms of beauty in the ashes of the old world. Perhaps that was Malenia's true legacy. Not the destruction she'd wrought, but the proof that life could adapt to any condition, could find ways to flourish even in the most impossible circumstances. The scarlet rot might be a curse, but it was also change, transformation, the promise that nothing, no matter how terrible, was truly permanent. I found Lady Millicent where I'd left her, camped in the ruins outside Ordina. But the days of waiting had not been kind to her. The corruption had advanced significantly, golden blooms now covering nearly half her body, her breathing labored and irregular. When she saw me approaching, her face lit up with desperate hope. "You returned," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had begun to fear. But you're here. Do you have it? Did you find the needle?" I knelt beside her makeshift bed, carefully removing the case from my pack. The needle seemed to sense its proximity to the rot, its humming growing stronger, more insistent. "I found it. But Lady Millicent, I need you to understand, this will cure the corruption, but it won't undo what you've experienced. You'll be changed by this, marked by having carried the rot even after it's gone." She tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that flecked her lips with golden blood. "Changed? My dear sellsword, look at me. I'm already changed beyond recognition. Whatever the needle can give me, life, death, or something in between, it's better than this slow dissolution into something I don't understand." The procedure itself was surprisingly simple. I pressed the needle's point to the largest bloom on her arm, feeling the artifact's power surge outward, like water breaking through a dam. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The golden flowers began to wither and fall away. The crystalline growths dissolved like sugar in rain. The fever-bright gleam in her eyes dimmed to something more recognizably human. But even as the physical corruption faded, I could see that she was indeed changed. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a depth of understanding that spoke of having looked into the abyss and returned with knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. She would live, but she would never again be the same woman who had approached me with desperate hope and a fortune in payment. "How do you feel?" I asked, as the last of the visible corruption faded from her skin. She flexed her fingers, testing the restored sensation, then looked up at me with eyes that held echoes of gold. Different, not just healed, but expanded, as if I can see connections between things that were always there, but invisible before. She paused, studying my face with new intensity. "You're changed too. What did you see up there? What did you face in the highest reaches of the Haligtree?" I told her everything, about the clean rot knights and their mechanical devotion, about Elphael and its beautiful corruption, about the scarred pilgrim who had tried to warn me of the futility of my quest, and finally about Malenia herself, not the legend of the undefeated goddess, but the reality of a woman trapped by her own power, condemned to eternal vigil by love that had curdled into obsession. Lady Millicent listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring up at the poisoned sky of Caelid with newfound comprehension. "She's still there," she said finally. Still waiting, still hoping for something that may never come. Yes. And you left her there. You could have tried to find some way to help her, to break her free from that cycle of eternal struggle. I couldn't have helped her, I replied. Even if I'd been strong enough to defeat her, which I wasn't, that wouldn't have freed her. It would have just proven that she could lose, which might have been its own kind of curse. Some prisons can only be escaped from within. She nodded slowly, then reached into her pack and withdrew the payment she'd promised. More wealth than I'd ever seen in one place, enough to set me up for life if I was careful with it. But as she held it out to me, I found myself hesitating. Keep half of it, I said finally. Use it to help others who carry the rot. There are treatments that can slow its progress, scholars who study ways to adapt to its effects rather than simply fighting them. The needle worked for you because we caught it early enough, but there are others who've progressed too far for such simple solutions. And what will you do? I looked back toward the halig tree, its impossible bulk visible even from this distance, glowing with its own internal light against the red sky. I'll tell her story, the real story, not the legend. People should know what the price of godhood really is, what it costs to love something so much that you're willing to destroy yourself to protect it. Lady Millicent pressed the reduced payment into my hands, her touch warm and reassuringly human. Then we both have our work ahead of us. I'll tend to the living and you'll remember the lost. We parted ways the next morning, she heading south toward the settlements where she could begin her new mission, me turning north toward the lands beyond Caelid, where people still told stories around fires and believed that heroes could overcome any challenge through strength and determination. I would tell them a different story. I would tell them about a warrior who had never known defeat because defeat itself had become meaningless to her, about love so pure it became poison, about sacrifice so complete it transformed the one making it into something beyond recognition, about the terrible price of power and the even more terrible price of powerlessness. But most of all, I would tell them about the sound, that metallic scraping that echoed through the halls of the halig tree, patient and eternal, marking time until the day someone comes who can offer not victory, but understanding, not conquest, but compassion. Somewhere behind me in the highest reaches of an impossible tree, Malenia continued her vigil. The blade of Miquella, the goddess of rot, the woman who had sacrificed everything for love and gained only loneliness in return. She would wait and hope and dream her poisoned dreams, because that was all she had left. And I would carry her story to anyone willing to listen, because some burdens become lighter when shared, and some truths become more bearable when witnessed. The needle had served its purpose. Lady Millicent was cured, her life restored, her future open once again to possibilities beyond slow corruption and inevitable death. But the real healing, the kind that touches souls rather than flesh, that would take longer, perhaps generations longer. In my pack, alongside my payment and supplies, I carried something more valuable than gold or silver, the memory of golden eyes filled with tears that would never stop flowing, of a voice that spoke of love and loss with equal measures of beauty and despair. Some stories once heard change the listener forever. Some truths once learned cannot be unlearned. I had climbed the halig tree seeking a cure for corruption, and I had found it. But I had also found something else, proof that the most dangerous battles are not fought with swords and armor, but with hope and memory, and the terrible courage it takes to love something more than life itself. The scraping sound had faded now, lost in the distance and the wind, but I knew I would hear it again in my dreams, calling me back to witness and remember, and carry forward the story of what it truly means to face a goddess who has never known defeat. Because in the end, that was the only victory that mattered, not defeating Malenia but understanding her, not conquering the rot but accepting what it represented, not claiming heroic triumph, but acknowledging the price that heroism demands from those who dare to pay it. The lands between stretched out before me, vast and terrible and beautiful, full of stories yet to be discovered and truths yet to be learned. But I would never again approach any challenge with the naive confidence I'd once possessed. I had seen what lay beyond victory and defeat, beyond hope and despair, beyond the simple certainties that made life bearable for those who had never climbed high enough to witness the view from the top of the world. And somehow, That knowledge felt like the most valuable treasure of all.